The Committee on Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Africa will come to order. The purpose of this hearing is to examine the fiscal year 2024 State and Foreign Operations Budget Request for Africa. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. Assistant Secretary Molly Fee, Assistant Administrator Monde Muyangwa, it is my pleasure to welcome you before the Subcommittee on Africa this hearing examining the President's budget request for Africa. I'll be leading a congressional delegation to the DRC, Tanzania, and Nigeria this summer, and I look forward to this morning's hearing to learn more about the administration's approach to the African continent. The U.S. national security strategy emphasizes the role of the strategic competition in foreign policy. Throughout Africa, the Chinese Communist Party uses the Belt and Road Initiative as a Trojan horse to curtail freedoms and erode institutions, while the Russian Federation and the Kremlin-supported Wagner Group create and perpetuate instability, profiting off the backs of Africans. Despite these realities, the U.S. strategy towards sub-Saharan Africa does not once mention strategic competition. It only mentions China once. I am concerned that this dissonance at the top is reflected in the lack of resolve to ensure that you have the necessary resources in place to strengthen and deepen our partnerships on the continent. In today's resource-constrained environment, it's imperative that we prioritize our limited resources on Africa on programs that most benefit U.S. national interests, and that starts with its people. U.S. embassies throughout Africa have struggled to keep pace with the profound transformations across the continent, and while I commend the Foreign Service officers serving on the front lines of diplomacy, there are persistent and widespread staffing gaps that have a material impact on diplomatic capacity to engage compared to China's large and growing presence on the continent. I look forward to hearing how the department is looking at making sure personnel are more efficiently allocated in global foreign service system with the appropriate incentives to build the American presence on the continent. Switching to programs, the failed UN peacekeeping missions in Mali, Central Africa, African Republic, and the DRC cost the United States taxpayers $975 million in the last fiscal year alone. Let me say that again. Nearly $1 billion in the last fiscal year alone. The purpose of these peacekeeping missions is to prevent conflict and create the conditions for peace. And yet, by comparison, the Global Fragility Act, which is intended to be the U.S.'s long-term strategy to stabilize conflict-affected areas and prevent violence, is provided only $100 million annually for the entire coastal West Africa region, a region that's at high risk of instability. U.S. global health programs such as PEPFAR and the President's Malaria Initiative have been unmitigated successes and have saved millions of lives across Africa. The successes of these decades-long investments in these initiatives can be built upon and applied to other priorities across the continent. Advancing two-way trade rather than just aid, and investment between U.S. and African partners must be a key foreign policy priority, not simply $55 billion commitment made without follow-up. I'm currently working on legislation relating to the DRC's critical mineral sector, specifically in creating a strategy to balance our national security responsibility to ensure continued access to key mineral commodities such as cobalt and lithium, with the appalling working conditions present in the DRC mining sector, and the extremely opaque business and climate that exists throughout the country. I look forward to working with you both as this legislative effort progresses, and hearing your thoughts on how we can improve and get better in a U.S. economic relationship. Additionally, and if I can be frank, I'm concerned that these limited resources for the African continent are being used to force a social and climate agenda upon unwilling African partners. And from what I've heard from representatives of the African nations, it is further validating concerns that many on the continent have. Africans are not vassals, they're equals. And a finger-wagging, we know it all and better than you foreign policy just reinforces the stereotypes that are being pushed by the Russians, the Chinese, and those who would hurt us. Is perceived as highly hypocritical when we would lecture, when the Saudis also have problems with women's rights, and the Chinese leverage slave labor, and is perceived as racist when they see billions going to Ukraine when areas in Africa, to include Sudan, are worse? What are we doing to mitigate this perception of hypocrisy and racism in American foreign policy with Africa? In advance of this hearing, Congressman Mills, the vice chair of this subcommittee, sent you both a letter detailing specific U.S. aid and State Department programs of concern throughout Africa, and I really look forward to hearing how you explain these programs to secure U.S. interests in the face of African nations, many of whom have complained on the methods of their employment. In closing, the United States is a reliable and valued partner to many on the African continent, but more must be done to ensure that our limited government must be more focused, and funding the continent is used most efficiently and effective to advance U.S. national interests, but not at the expense of our African partners. The chair now recognizes Ranking Member, Congresswoman from California, Ms. Jacobs, for any statement she may have.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Assistant Secretary Fee and Assistant Administrator Muyangwa, for testifying before this committee today on the FY24 Africa budget and U.S. policy in Africa. Today's hearing gives us important opportunity to examine the Biden administration's FY24 budget request for Africa and to conduct oversight of U.S. policy in sub-Saharan Africa. The African continent plays a critical role on the world stage. It has the youngest population and is expected to outpace Asia as the fastest growing region in the world, with 6 out of the 10 fastest growing economies. There is so much we can learn from African countries on many of our shared goals, like prioritizing climate resiliency, being a leader on global health, and strengthening trade and investment. But like anywhere else, the region is also facing challenges like addressing democratic backsliding, political instability, poverty, food insecurity, and the economic impacts of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It's long overdue for the United States to truly prioritize Africa in its broader foreign policy. And it's why I've been so encouraged by and focused on the Biden administration's U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit, the first of its kind since 2014. With this summit, the United States committed $55 billion to the African continent over the next 3 years in human capital, infrastructure, agriculture, health systems, and securing investments, including the Digital Transformation for Africa, an initiative designed to expand digital access and literacy across the continent that will invest over $350 million and facilitate $450 million in financing, a really exciting effort that helps bring our engagement to the 21st century. The new President's Advisory Council on African Diaspora Engagement in the United States to deepen the dialogue between U.S. officials and the African diaspora, a long overdue initiative that leverages the huge African diaspora population and better incorporates diaspora communities into U.S. policy. New programs advancing democracy and good governance, like the $100 million 3-year pilot program, the 21st Century Partnership for African Security Initiative to support security sector reform efforts, and the $75 million 3-year program, the African Democratic Political Transitions Initiative to address democratic backsliding, and so many other important and long overdue initiatives that I hope we can hear more about today. I particularly want to commend President Biden's announcement of U.S. support for the African Union's bid to join the G20 as a permanent member, where they are directly impacted by the decisions made on the global stage. Earlier this week, I introduced a resolution supporting the AU's bid to join the G20, and this critical commitment by President Biden with the support of the rest of my Democratic colleagues on the Africa Subcommittee. With all of these announcements, we now need to ensure that we're following through on our promises. Because the worst thing we can do is have this summit, make all of these announcements, make a big deal, and then not live up to what our commitments promised. So I'm glad we're addressing the budget today, because we all know that reduced funding will make implementation of these commitments even harder. Earlier this month, House Republicans unveiled their proposed international affairs budget, which cuts the budget by nearly 31%, a total of $18.3 billion compared to last year. Slashing foreign
10-year anniversary, the initiative has closed 145 transactions and facilitated access to electricity for more than 179 million people. The $100 million request will accelerate efforts to increase electricity generation in sub-Saharan Africa in support of the Electrify Africa Act. The President's request prioritizes engagement with African partners to promote democratic ideals and foster legitimate, transparent, and inclusive political systems. The $436.3 million democracy request will provide critical resources to build on USAID's new Democracy Delivers initiative, which bolsters countries experiencing windows of democratic opportunity. In countries such as Tanzania, Zambia, and Malawi, this support is vital to sustain democratic transitions and consolidate gains. The President's request also includes initiatives announced during the December 2022 part of the U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit. The first, the Africa Democratic and Political Transitions Initiative, includes a request for $25 million to enable the U.S. government to more effectively partner with regional bodies, governments, and civil societies to support successful democratic transition. The second, the Digital Transformation with Africa Initiative, is a request of $50 million to help expand affordable and inclusive digital connectivity, build digital resilience, and improve livelihoods and economic well-being of Africans. The President's FY24 request prioritizes the U.S. government's Global Hunger and Food Security Initiative, Feed the Future. The request of $487.5 million for food security increases funding support and aligns resources for the 8 new Feed the Future countries in Africa. In addition, U.S. assistance will help African countries adapt to severe weather and other shocks and conserve biodiversity while growing their economies. The President's request of more than $5 billion for global health, including life-saving PEPFAR programs in sub-Saharan Africa, will build on partnerships, including with the private sector, to strengthen health systems to provide essential services, prevent, detect, and respond to infectious disease outbreaks, and promote innovation and research. The President's request of $20 million for the Young African Leaders Initiative will scale training and expand partner engagement. We will continue to provide opportunities for YALI alumni through transformational leadership training, networking, and professional development. In conclusion, the President's 24 budget request demonstrates our renewed commitment to partnerships between the United States and Africa. Again, I appreciate your longstanding bipartisan commitment to the African continent, and I thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Assistant Secretary. Excuse me, Assistant, you got your promotion right there. How about that?
I did.
Thank you, Assistant Administrator Muyangwa. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning. A few weeks ago, we had Secretary of State, Secretary Anthony Blinken, here for a number of questions, and I had the opportunity to question the Secretary myself for a few minutes, and I asked for his commitment and support on solidifying American supply chains and driving out slavery and human rights violations, among many things. And I'm currently working on legislation relating to the DRC's critical mineral sector, specifically in creating a strategy to balance our national security responsibility to ensure continued access to key mineral commodities such as cobalt and lithium with the appalling working conditions present in the DRC mining sector and the extremely opaque business climate that exists throughout the country. I look forward to working with the Secretary and with each of you as we move forward this legislative effort. Assistant Secretary Fee, in addition to some of your concerns that we discussed recently, I've also been closely following President Tshisekedi's recent visit to Beijing and the negotiation between his government and the CCP-linked mining companies. A couple of questions for you. What is the department's belief regarding the purpose and the outcome of President Tshisekedi's visit to Beijing? And 2, what is the department's view regarding the current trajectory of the DRC-China relationship?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As a leader of a large and complicated country, we anticipate and assess that President Tshisekedi likes to have many options, as many leaders would, as he considers how to develop his country's resources. But we are confident that the United States is a better partner, and that is his view, that we are a better partner and one he would prefer to engage with. So we are looking very seriously at opportunities for development in the critical minerals sector. You may have seen that the Development Finance Corporation recently announced a project to build a transport corridor from Zambia through DRC to Angola to help move resources from the DRC to export market.
Madam Assistant Secretary, do you have the resources? Do you have the heads to specifically focus on an effort like that, specific with critical minerals in the DRC? Do you have that resource?
I would say the short answer to that is no, but I would also like to share with you, if I might, how we got to this position and what we need to do to get out of this position.
Perfect.
So, as you may be aware, in recent years, there was a hiring freeze at the State Department, and we failed to hire to respond to attrition. The Secretary has included in his budget requests immense requests, relatively speaking, to increase our staffing, and that hiring and training process is underway. But there's a gap between where we need to go and where we are, so we're working on some creative solutions within the department to identify talent to help us take advantage of opportunities specifically in the DRC. I would ask this committee to lend your support to the budget requests that the administration has made for the State Department. Relatively speaking, in our grand national budget, it's a reasonable request, and it will provide us with the predictability and the stability to carry out our shared goals.
And the second question, with the last minute or so, what's the department's view regarding the current trajectory of the DRC-China relationship?
Again, my understanding, based on my witness of President Tshisekedi's engagement with President Biden and his repeated engagement with Secretary Blinken, is that the United States remains the preferred partner, and it is our responsibility to show up and ensure that we remain in that privileged position.
I now recognize Ranking Member Jacob for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you again, both of you, for testifying. I want to start this conversation by talking about not just the FY24 request, but what level of funding Congress is likely to pass. House Republicans have proposed cuts to the international affairs budget of nearly 31%. Assistant Secretary Fee and Assistant Administrator Muyangwa, could you please provide the committee a brief overview of what these kinds of cuts could mean for our work in Africa and our ability to lead and do all of the things that we want you to be able to do?
Dr. Mande is a great partner to me, so we never know which one should speak first. This is an exciting time to be involved in African affairs. Finally, the United States is, as President Biden said in December, all in on Africa. We have many opportunities, as we've discussed. And again, we believe our values, our approach, our processes, our innovation, our technologies, everything you can imagine makes us the best bet for our African friends. But to capitalize on this opportunity, we need those resources. So we have sufficient funds to respond to the programming needs, both building on the excellent programs we have that are well appreciated and have had a demonstrable impact, and to invest in new efforts such as the Global Fragility Act to make sure that we can address what have been sort of entrenched challenges and problems.
Thank you so much for that question. I'd add 3 other areas where we would see impact. Obviously, it would impact our whole development agenda on the African continent, but let me focus on 3 of those. If we cut the budget, Power Africa's would not be able to deliver electricity to 2.8 million households across the continent. And we know what an amplifier the access to energy is in terms of development. Similarly, with Prosper Africa, if we were to cut the request there, we would not be able to really lean into the plans that we have to advance two-way trade between the United States and Africa to unlock the business potential that resides on the continent, and also to encourage more American businesses to invest in Africa. The third area I would focus on is on the education front. If we were unable to, if we did not get the requests that we have put in, the literacy rates in Africa had already taken a downward trajectory due to COVID and other factors, and we've been working to build that up to try and raise those literacy rates. The implications for development, again, given education's impact or link to development, is huge, particularly on a continent where 1 in 4 in 5 will be African by 2050.
Yeah, thank you. And I hope my colleagues on both sides of the aisle hear how detrimental the proposed cuts would be for the things we all want to do on the African continent. Really quickly, in our last minute and a half, I want to talk about the Global Fragility Act. As you both know, Mozambique and coastal West Africa are priority countries, and this law is really about doing things differently, which means coordinating across the interagency and realigning our funding and empowering local partners. And while we know that a different bureau is the lead at the State Department, Congress expects the regional bureaus to be part of this too, and to prioritize the country strategies. So Assistant Secretary Fee, I just wanted you to discuss how you plan to do this for Mozambique and coastal West Africa.
Thanks very much for your support for this incredibly important program. I want you to know that I have directed all of the ambassadors in countries that are benefiting from this program that this should be their #1 priority, that we need to have this program succeed to demonstrate that the new authorities and resources you gave us and the new way of thinking and approaching will work. As you know, we're focused on 3 different types of activities: social inclusion, government responsiveness, and accountability of security forces. I think we're already beginning to see the impact of the initial funding, and the teams work together closely, and we worked closely with the other bureau, the CSO Bureau, and I'm confident you're going to see a good return on that investment.
Thank you. I yield back.
Chairman now recognizes Rep. Kim for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman James and Ranking Members Jacobs for holding this hearing. I want to thank our witnesses for joining us today. The civil war in Sudan has only gotten worse since fighting began on April 15. And without the U.S. leadership on the Sudan crisis, the humanitarian catastrophe will worsen, and Moscow will emerge as the victor. The Wagner-backed Rapid Support Forces has already publicly expressed openness to a Russian naval base at Port Sudan, with resurrecting its genocidal tactics in Darfur. The Sudanese armed forces' reliance on imprecise air power and artillery has taken a very heavy civilian toll with little military success. Assistant Secretary Fee, I wanted to find out what is the senior level task organization and roles and responsibilities within the State Department for handling U.S. policy towards Sudan. And during the past periods of conflict in Sudan, the U.S. has utilized the role of a special envoy. And I was wondering if such an appointment would be constructive to advance U.S. policy in Sudan.
Thank you very much for your question about such a critical crisis in a critical part of the continent. The Secretary of State, Secretary Blinken, has been personally and directly involved, and we focused our efforts on 3 prongs. The first prong has been emergency diplomacy, working with our partners, the Saudis, who have unique influence with both sets of security actors. We have worked to try and achieve ceasefires to reduce the level of violence and allow the delivery of humanitarian assistance. Those ceasefires have not been fully effective, although they have allowed the transmittal of important, urgently needed humanitarian assistance. However, on yesterday, we adjourned those talks because the format is not succeeding in the way that we want. The second important prong is our support, which is our longstanding support for the Sudanese civilians against their oppressive military, whether it's the SAF, the Sudanese Armed Forces, or the Rapid Support Forces. So we are working closely with Sudanese civilians and with our partners in Africa, particularly at the African Union and the regional organization IGAD, as well as other interested partners such as the EU, the United Nations, and the Arab League, to see how we can lend our collective support to promote Sudanese civilian leadership of Sudan. As the security forces have demonstrated, they have no right to have any role in governance. And the third prong is humanitarian assistance, which I might ask Dr. Mande to address, fulfilling our longstanding role as the leading donor in the world, as well as the leading donor in Sudan.
So to the question that I just posed, would a special envoy would be able to carry out all of these three-pronged solutions that you just mentioned, because you said the conversation started, but it has not advanced to the level that we can actually carry those out?
Yes, the Secretary is considering elevating the role of Ambassador John Godfrey, who knows all the players. But I want to emphasize that the entire U.S. government is fully engaged in addressing this crisis, given its impact not only for Sudan, but for the region.
Okay. I also wanted to ask if you can describe the State Department's efforts to engage civilian groups in Sudan. What is the department's plan to achieve that long-term goal of a political transition towards a civilian role in Khartoum?
We have been in daily contact with Sudanese civilians, which has been somewhat challenging given the collapse of the communications network and the fighting that they are living under. But there are also many Sudanese leaders outside of Sudan, including the former civilian prime minister, Abdullah Hamdok. Just last week, I, along with colleagues from USAID, chaired a meeting under the support of the former Sudanese ambassador to the United States with key critical leaders to talk to them about who should be involved in the process to establish a civilian government, where should that process take place, and when should that take place? So we continue to
Quickly, I wanted to ask, because I serve as the chairwoman of the Indo-Pacific Subcommittee too, so one of my priorities is finding ways to incorporate more private sector initiatives into our foreign policy to better equip our diplomats to compete with our PRC counterparts. So do you think our ambassadors and the embassy staff are sufficiently equipped in supporting and advocating for our private sector throughout the African continent, especially when contrasted with the high level of diplomatic support afforded to the Chinese and European countries? Could you make that comparison?
Sure. Well, first of all, we welcome your support for that initiative. And in Vice President Harris's recent trip to the continent, she secured commitments from the private sector in the billions to actually undergird the digital transformation initiative that we described to you. We also have partners on the continent from the Development Finance Corporation and from the Department of Commerce's Foreign Commercial Services. But if you ask me if we could use more, the answer would be yes.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I now recognize Rep. Sherfilis McCormick for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Last year, the USAID announced the Africa Localization Initiative to direct more funding to local organizations in sub-Saharan Africa. As part of its larger localization agenda, the administration has not asked for additional funding to implement this initiative. My first question goes to Assistant Administrator Mayenga. Sorry about the pronunciation. Can you elaborate on the status of implementing this initiative, including potential focus countries?
Thank you very much for that question. So localization is very, very important to the success of USAID's work on the continent, and we are continuing to make progress on that front. We just issued USAID's localization report in March of this year, which shows where we are, and some of our missions on the African continent are doing quite well, but we continue to push and to plan and to implement so we can make even more progress in that end. To that end, We have 12 countries that are now participating, or 12 missions that are participating in the Africa Localization Initiative. And we are working with them to develop their plans and to implement, and we will take lessons from those 12 missions and see what we can do to amplify our localization efforts across the continent.
Thank you. And how is the USAID viewing this program in comparison to the Central America Local Initiative?
We learned a lot from the Central American Initiative, and so we built some of those lessons learned to inform how we are working on the African component of it, obviously contextualized to the African situation. But we work together to share lessons learned and to figure out how we can continue to amplify localization across the agency.
To what extent are you thinking about lessons learned on localization from PEPFAR on the continent?
I would say that those lessons learned have been built into how we are thinking about localization. In fact, our health sector had the highest percentage of localization of all of our programming. And so it's a very good place for us to start in terms of figuring out how we embed those lessons learned to our future efforts.
And I want to ask specific questions about health. What are the administration's priorities regarding PEPFAR programming in Africa as Congress considers the potential reauthorization of the program this year?
So PEPFAR has been, if not the most transformative health program in the world. Its impact on the continent has been absolutely changing and transformative, starting out in 20 years ago, when very few Africans had access to life-saving medications, to today, where we have 18 million Africans who are able to access medications. We have a number of countries that have really made a lot of progress. We have reduced maternal deaths on the continent. We have improved the number of children who are born HIV/AIDS-free. We have made significant progress in terms of addressing the malaria. So a lot of achievements on the African continent, but we still have a lot of work to do. And so as we look to 2030, when we are looking to get to the 95-95-95 formula that has been put out there for HIV/AIDS, it's critically important that we continue to support those efforts, because our inability to support those efforts will mean losing the gains that we have made over the last few years. And so that's critically important. The second area in terms of the president's budget has to do with enhancing pandemic support, the response to pandemics. And so building that capacity, as we saw with COVID, that is critically important that we continue to build those capacities, because it impacts not just Africa, but the rest of the world as well. So there's a lot of work to do, and that request is fundamentally important to the success of our engagement with the continent.
The FY 2024 request would reduce funding for water and sanitation programs by nearly 50% from 2022 levels. Though cholera and other waterborne illnesses remain a threat in the region, what is the reason behind that proposed decrease?
I think it's it's looking broadly at all of the issues and challenges that we are facing on the continent. And it's also looking at the opportunities that we have to leverage other programs to achieve work in certain areas. So it's that shift of resources to still remain committed to the continent, still remain committed to the health area, but also looking at areas where we can continue to do the work that doesn't undermine our overall objectives in that sector. I think that's one. I think the second area for us, and the administrator has been very strong on this, is figuring out how we crowd in resources from other partners to enable us to continue doing the work that we need to do in these other areas. So those are two prongs that we would be pursuing.
Thank you for your testimony. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize Rep. Baird for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to thank our witnesses for being here. My first question deals with the fact that last week, the House Foreign Affairs Committee, we held a hearing that the U.S. doing to counter China's Belt and Road Initiative, BRI. One of my questions pertain to the actions this administration is taking to counter Chinese involvement with AGOA approved countries that have duty-free access to U.S. markets. The Communist Party, CCC, has leveraged large-scale investments in many sub-Saharan AGOA countries, eligible countries. Many of these investments have a tied aid approach that are backed by unrepayable terms and burdensome collateral commitments. My concern is that the U.S. taxpayer dollars that are being spent in Africa by the State Department and USAID are going directly into the hands of the CCP in disguise as repayments by those countries, and Americans are footing the bill. So my question gets down to, what is USAID and the State Department doing to oversee where these funds are being used, and that Chinese are not just using these funds to funnel U.S. taxpayer dollars into their pockets? So if you can give me any kind of a sense of what you're doing in that area, I would appreciate it. Either one of you.
Thank you very much for your question. Of course, Chinese predatory practices in Africa, which include the BRI investment that increases debt burden, and also unsavory practices with regard to the environment and labor, are of major concern to the United States government. The kind of programming we're trying to offer as an alternative, whether it be through Millennium Challenge Corporation investment in, for example, regional transportation, the Development Finance Corporation financing for major investments to build transportation pipelines for mineral export, or Exim Bank financing, all comes with built-in protections to ensure that that funding is used properly and transparently with accountability. Separately, we are working with governments such as the new leadership in Zambia, where the previous leadership had incurred a great Chinese debt burden, at the Paris Club and other G20 discussions to help reduce the debt loads. So those are two examples of the way in which we're safeguarding U.S. investment and resources and helping our African partners move away from those predatory practices.
One more to continue on with that. Do you feel that we're being successful in competing with China? I mean, they fund everything in terms of ports and railroads and other resources, and so are those African countries accepting our offers?
We do different types of funding. As you heard from Dr. Mande, for example, we invest in people and in systems. So, for example, our impact on African health has been, as she said, transformative. But part of the reason it's been transformative is that assistance has helped build African health systems so that they're going to be better able to respond and work with us for pandemics, whether they're COVID, Ebola, most recently Marburg. So we have not traditionally invested U.S. government in big infrastructure projects the way the Chinese have. Some of those have been helpful to the continent, particularly roads, but some we have concerns about and are taking actions about. For example, we're keeping a close eye on investments in ports to make sure that ports aren't developed that would threaten the United States. So we have different ways of engaging. Our practices, of course, also are focused on anti-corruption, unlike the Chinese, and again, as I mentioned, on labor standards and environmental standards. So we believe in an open competition. Our processes and approach, our technology, our ways of doing business will be most attractive to our African partners.
Dr. Monier, we're out of time, I guess, so I yield back, but I would like to have your comments on that too at some point. Thank you.
I now recognize Rep. Jackson for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. James, this is an open question. The AGOA, African Growth Opportunity Act, is up for renewal in 2025. Please share with us your insights on what that bill should look like, what we should be asking for to give us a sustainable competitive advantage in Africa. And let me parenthetically say, I am glad that there is renewed interest. We've had a long relationship with Africa that we've chose not to invest in the continent. So what should it look like going forward?
Thanks very much for your interest and your support. You've rightly identified AGOA as a key component of our economic partnership with Africa. One of the outcomes of the Leaders Summit was to amplify our engagement to promote trade and investment. That's our signature initiative. And first of all, I would welcome congressional support for its renewal. We're also engaged in discussions now about whether or not the program should be adjusted. It's had a positive impact in the 35 countries who have benefited from those trade privileges, but it has not been fully optimized. So there's discussions underway with USTR and the State Department's chief economist about possible ways we might recommend you consider to update the bill. I would say that, as the chairman noted in his opening statement, it's a good bridge to doing more trade and less aid. That was one of the original elements of the design to help Africans climb out of poverty, help develop jobs, and help improve their economies through trade rather than aid.
And I would just add to that throughout its existence, USAID has played a critical role in supporting AGOA, and we stand ready to continue to provide that support. The support that we have provided includes helping member countries develop national AGOA implementation plans and helping them navigate the rules and regulations pertaining to AGOA, helping them through the meeting the standards of participation in AGOA. And so we would continue to provide that support to AGOA, given it's a critical part of our larger trade and investment infrastructure.
Okay, I'd like to make one comment on that before I ask a follow-up question. I find it remarkable that we've had a 200-plus year relationship with Africa, and we did not have an African trading policy officially until 2000. It's rather reprehensible, and that we've seen a Marshall Plan, we've seen the rebuilding of Japan, but we've never forcefully said this is how we're going to invest across the continent of Africa. And in the last 20 years, we've seen the Chinese talk about communications infrastructure. We've seen them in 2010 talk about the Belt and Road Initiative. It's been concrete plans, and they have been successful, although many African countries have not had an alternative. They've had the opportunity to go to the IMF, and those programs did not work. So when we talk about onerous conditions and expensive funding, we have not offered them many viable alternatives. So I'm glad to see that we're talking about reciprocal trade. In Sudan specifically, the 2020 Congress appropriated $900 million for the Sudanese government before the 2021 coup. What would you think? How much of that money was spent, and is there anything that we could have done different?
Thanks for that question. Although that subject was handled prior to my confirmation as Assistant Secretary, I think there's a consensus that we did not move the money out quickly enough to have the desired impact. And in fact, in my confirmation hearing, I committed to accelerating our disbursement of those funds. I started work in October, and that's when the coup happened, so we didn't have time to mobilize. That said, it's not uncommon in countries that have had such difficult histories as Sudan has, 30 years of an Islamist dictatorship by a military leader, that the transition, we might have expected that the transition would be bumpy. But I think if that was your question, sir, we did not move the money fast enough.
Thank you.
I would agree with my colleague here, and the only thing I would add to that there is a request from USAID for close to $50 million in the '24 budget to support Sudan, and that is underpinned by our commitment to supporting the people of Sudan in their democratic aspirations, but also our recognition that Sudan resides in a very restive region, and our ability to be able to provide the support is critically important, not just for Sudan, but for the entire region and our interest in that region.
Thank you for your participation and coming forward with us today. I yield my time, Chairman.
Thank you, Rep. Jackson. I now yield myself 5 minutes questioning. Assistant Secretary Fee, the Monomo-Katolo mine in the DRC is one of the largest, if not the largest, in the world. President Biden's climate change agenda is pretty aggressive by all measures. The automotive industry has been tagged with the obligation to meet these greenhouse gas emissions targets, lest they pay fees. According to NHTSA last year, could cost the industry $90 billion and another $9 billion in fees for noncompliance. And that's not to mention any other penalties that could come from any other agencies in the administration. Given these aggressive goals, I imagine that you support the President's climate agenda. Is your department also given metrics, and are you also tracking the fact that President Tshisekedi was in Beijing negotiating the sale and the control of one of the largest lithium mines in the world, as it's nearly impossible to currently make electric vehicles without lithium this past weeks in Beijing?
Mr. Chairman, again, I welcome your interest in the DRC and in the role that DRC critical minerals will play for the United States and globally. We are working with his government to see what might be possible in terms.
Are you being measured by anything? We say that there's transformational change. We say that there are meetings. We say that there are there any goals that you have to hit? Are there any metrics that you are measuring to kind of define and be transparent with the success or not of the American taxpayers' efforts and money and kind of tracking our progress in the region?
In terms of the DRC.
The fact that the President
Yes.
has such aggressive goals
Yes.
with EV transformation,
Yes.
yet the control for the largest lithium mine in the world may have been negotiated to China. I understand that if we have these goals, if we are putting metrics and goals and having penalties in the automotive industry, then we in the government should also have metrics and goals that we're following to facilitate the potential penalties that we'd be imposing on American companies. Are you aware, and are you tracking any goals?
Yes, the interagency is focused very much on critical minerals and identifying and pursuing opportunities to ensure a U.S. investment in that sector.
What are those goals? Are they numbers, or can you share those goals?
Why don't I follow up with you on?
I would appreciate that
okay,
follow. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Another one, is the Wagner Group a threat to Africa?
The Wagner Group is a predatory group that exploits existing challenges in Africa.
Is the Wagner Group a threat to the United States of America and its allies?
I do not believe it's a threat to us, but it's a threat to the interests of our partners in Africa.
There are a lot of things that we're seeing in Africa that are reminiscent to the Afghanistan and Pakistan issues that we saw 20 years ago. Wagner Group is absolutely a terrorist threat in Africa, and it can absolutely hurt us in the United States of America. That is one of the biggest reasons that Africa is important. I also have a question about Sudan. Are you familiar with GSK, a security company in Sudan?
No, I'm not.
Okay, it's a small technology and security company that's based in Sudan. The Tradive General Trading LLC is used for funding the operations of Hemeti and the RSF. Mohammed Idrisi is partner with Ahmed Musa, Dagalo's younger brother, and is in a partnership with Wagner. Idrisi moves all the money for Hemeti. What I've heard is that these are things that happen prior to your stationing in your position. But the war in Sudan is currently being funded by stealing the resources, the natural resources from the Sudanese. Are we doing anything to counteract these forces, the funding of the Wagner Group, and the continued violence in Sudan?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Earlier this month, we imposed sanctions on 2 sets of parastatals that are respectively affiliated with the Sudanese Armed Forces and with the Rapid Support Forces. GSK.
To what effect? Are we noticing any effect at all?
Well, the action was just taken this month. So I just wanted to mention to you that GSK is a subsidiary of Tradive, which is one of the RSF affiliated parastatals that we sanctioned. What would be helpful, and I would welcome your voice, is to encourage other governments to join us in our sanctions. The UK is considering doing so. The EU has been rather slow in making a decision to pursue sanctions, and we're in discussions with our Arab partners as well.
Thank you for your work here. I appreciate it and look forward to working with you. The chair now recognizes Rep. Kamlager-Dove for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's always appreciated when you invite me to these hearings. And Assistant Secretary Fee and Assistant Administrator Moyangwa, it is so great to see you both again after the presidential delegation to Nigeria that I had the privilege of participating in earlier this month with you. As important as it is to bolster our programming and funding commitments on the continent, this will yield little advancement if we don't have the people to implement them. So, Assistant Secretary Fee, what is the administration doing to address personnel gaps at U.S. diplomatic posts in the region and also to increase the diversity of our foreign service officers to reflect the population they are engaging in? And then what can we do to help make that happen?
Thanks very much for that question, which highlights the personal commitment of Secretary Blinken and all of his key staff, such as persons like myself, to do both more in getting staff for the State Department generally and to ensure that we attract and retain diverse talent. So on the first, as you are aware, we had a few years where there was a freeze on hiring and we failed to hire to replace those who departed. The administration and all of its budget requests has put forward large requests for additional staff. We would welcome support for those staffing requests so we can do better, but we have a gap between those we lost and those that are now coming online. So that's a challenge given that our renewed emphasis and elevation of the Africa file. With regard to the challenge of diversity, I think we're facing a challenge that many in the private sector also face, but there are concerted efforts from programs to personal leadership, mentorship, to try and, again, address both the issue of attracting the right talent and retaining the right talent.
Thank you for that. I mean, I hate to sound controversial, but it is always odd when I go to the continent of Africa and the only folks that are representing the United States of America are white people. It just makes me a little prickly. So please, I hope you share those remarks with the Secretary. I also had the privilege of traveling to Stockholm this weekend as part of a congressional delegation to the Transatlantic Legislators Dialogue to discuss mutual priorities with counterparts in the EU. And I have to say that I was dismayed by their level of dismissiveness when it came to investing in the continent of Africa. I can't tell you how many people rolled their eyes at me. I had to meditate. One shared interest that I believe needs to be elevated is increasing our partners' attention and investments in Africa because the United States can and should not do this work alone. So can you describe in what ways is state pressing our G7 partners to bolster their development financing and business investments in Africa. And if the Assistant Administrator would like to add to that, I would welcome.
Thank you for highlighting the important role of our partners. So when we're united, we can have maximum impact. As you know, the President has led the way in the G7 to mobilize G7 efforts to improve and increase investment in Africa, and also to leverage capital funds globally so that we marry U.S. government resources, other government resources, particularly from the West, and some venture capital funds that are available. We also meet routinely at every level of the U.S. government with the Europeans and with G7 partners. Africa is always a topic of conversation, including in the most recent G7 meetings in Japan. We fully agree with you that we need the Europeans to do more with us in Africa.
Thank you very much for that question, and it's good to see you again. So USAID approaches this from a number of vantage points. Let me start with the recent pledging conference on Sudan that just took place, where the United States has been the leading contributor to humanitarian efforts in Sudan. We got other partners to contribute to those efforts. We're still putting in a sizable amount of money compared to the others, but others stepped up to the plate. So I think that's really important. A second area in which we do this is what the administrator calls progress beyond programs, where we try to crowd in partners to add more resources to the areas and the work that we are already working on. And then Prosper Africa on the economic end also offers services that really seek to demystify Africa, both to our U.S. partners and others who are working in the economic space.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Thank you. I would like to recognize myself for questioning, but I want to continue this conversation with you, Assistant Secretary Muyanga, regarding the Prosper Africa. The fiscal year 24 budget request for Prosper Africa is designed to be the one-stop shop for all two-way trade and investment between the United States and Africa. That is currently at $100.5 billion. Currently, it is housed within USAID, but where does Prosper Africa fit into the agency's overall trade and investment strategy with Africa?
Thank you very much for that question. So while USAID serves as a secretariat for Prosper Africa is a 17-agency initiative. So USAID is actually just the secretariat for that. And it is really at the center of our economic engagement with the African continent, offering a lot of services in terms of encouraging U.S.-Africa trade and investment, and a lot has been done. We just had a great success story in terms of President Ruto announcing $150 million worth of investment, working with Prosper Africa and others between U.S. and Kenya. Prosper Africa does a lot in terms of connecting U.S. and African businesses. We have a virtual deal room, for example, which curates opportunities and facilitates U.S. companies and entrepreneurs being able to connect with those opportunities in Africa. We provide advisors to U.S. businesses and entrepreneurs who are interested in doing business in Africa. And those have, all of these efforts pulled together have yielded quite significant results, as both Assistant Secretary Fee and myself mentioned in our written remarks.
You know, I've noted that there is no Prosper Africa coordinator within the State Department, right?
The Prosper Africa coordinator actually resides
Or at USAID.
At USAID.
Yes.
And I am happy to share that the Prosper Africa coordinator will be coming on board imminently. And we just sent a message out to committee members this morning, I believe. But the
Given the
announcement,
importance, I think it's really important to have that coordinator to effectively navigate and coordinate the across the interagency. So I really support that, and I believe that coordinator position should be elevated and properly empowered. Wouldn't you agree? That's also a sentiment that is shared by many private sector representatives, both African and Americans. One more question to you. Where will the Prosper Africa Coordinator fit into that USAID hierarchy? And who would that person report to?
so the Prosper Africa Coordinator has a dotted line to the Assistant Administrator, myself, and that is mostly on coordination purposes. But the Prosper Africa Coordinator also has a strong link with our agency front office, as well as our administration. And so the Prosper Africa Coordinator really works across all of the agencies, the 17 agencies that I talked about.
Got it.
Coordinates with the Africa Bureau because it's an Africa-focused position,
Sure.
but also gets strategic guidance, direction from the larger
Thank
U.S.
you. I would
Africa
like to
strategy.
put in one more question into Assistant Secretary Fee.
Sure.
Given Africa's economic potential, it's really especially important that we have a very high-level commercial expertise in our embassies. Would you agree? Right. But I've noted also from 2016 to 2020, there were on average only 12 foreign commercial service officers in the entirety throughout the sub-Saharan Africa. And so would the State Department support more foreign commercial service officers being placed at embassies all throughout Africa?
Thank you for highlighting the need for more foreign commercial service officers, which of course is a program run by the Department of Commerce. You know, the President has an advisory council on doing business in Africa, and they recently completed a report which included a dozen or so recommendations, and that is one of their key recommendations. So I think that's a consensus view.
Perfect. And then we talked about the African Leadership Summit. Since then, I think we addressed it a little bit, but can you tell us what instructions have been sent to the embassies and consulates regarding that and, in order to advance commercial diplomacy goals, and when were they sent?
Thanks very much. This is the 6-month anniversary, so this is a great opportunity. We're doing a lot of public diplomacy to identify all the work that has been done in the past 6 months. Specifically regarding the economic diplomacy, we had an Africa Business Forum Day in which deals of $15.7 billion were announced. That number has now risen to $16.2 billion. One of our key leaders who had served at the National Security Council to help organize the summit is now working for the Chamber of Commerce specifically to follow up on implementation of those deals. And we are fully engaged with our embassies in pursuing the economic levers I've outlined.
Thank you so much. We went over time, but now I recognize Ranking Member Jacobs for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Assistant Secretary Fee, I was glad that we've talked a lot about the U.S. African Leaders Summit. I know you just answered questions on the commercial piece. I just wanted to make sure the State Department has sent out guidance and materials on implementation other than what's publicly available to the embassies and missions.
Yes.
Okay.
And also, just to update you, we established a website for the Leader Summit in December, and we're now going to transfer all of the programs and activities. We have at least 19 different departments and agencies who are moving in many ways, and we want to have points of contact so we facilitate follow-up.
Okay, wonderful. I'm so glad to hear that. I know when I was traveling on the continent, some of the ambassadors were still waiting for that guidance. I know we've also talked about Sudan a few times already. I'm particularly concerned by what we've seen in West Darfur, ethnic-based killings against the non-Arab Masalit tribes people by the RSF, and we know that the highest risk of atrocities and crimes against humanity and genocide is previous atrocities, and obviously, unfortunately, this region has seen decades of these kinds of killings. What is the State Department doing to address these killings, gather evidence, and proactively try to prevent another genocide in the region?
Thanks for highlighting the horrific crimes that are taking place in the Darfur region. We mobilized very quickly following the outbreak of the conflict to work with our colleagues in the Bureau, CSO Bureau, to establish something known as the Sudan Conflict Observatory, which has already begun publishing photographs and other images and documents to describe what's going on, including in the Darfur region. As you may have seen last week, we issued a statement in reaction to the assassination of the governor of West Darfur, and we've spoken directly to these problems, both publicly and in Jeddah, where we have been meeting with a delegation from the RSF, as well as through our engagement with the leadership of the RSF. The initial attention focused on Khartoum, because it was unusual to have that kind of fighting in a nation capital. But as we feared, given the RSF base in Darfur, the fighting has spread there.
I wanted to also ask you about U.S. policy on Mali and specifically MINUSMA. Now that we're likely to see a withdrawal of MINUSMA, how is the U.S. working with the UN to ensure an orderly and responsible withdrawal of troops, and how does this decision impact the new U.S. strategy towards Mali?
This is a deeply regrettable decision, which is one in a pattern of regrettable decisions by the transitional government that will threaten the interests of the people of Mali. As you know well, once a government withdraws consent for a peacekeeping mission, it's not possible to keep the mission on the ground. But it's one of the largest missions in Africa, and we will need to work responsibly together with other members of the Security Council, as well as with the transitional authorities, to make sure that the drawdown does not worsen the situation. The choices that the transitional government has been making have been the subject of concern and criticism by the United States and other partners, and to their partners in the region, who are also concerned about the impact the deterioration of the situation will have on their interests.
Thank you. And lastly, I mentioned in my open remarks President Biden's support for the AU to become part of the G20. There's wide-ranging support for that here in Congress and the international community. When do you expect this to happen?
It's our expectation that that should take place this year, likely in the fall. And I'm glad you've raised that point, because one of the important outcomes of the Leaders Summit was our effort to elevate Africa in the global conversation. So not only the G20, and thank you for your legislative reinforcement, also support for an African permanent seat on the Security Council. And I wanted to mention, in response to an earlier question, that Secretary Yellen is undertaking an effort to update the IFEs and the MDBs to make sure they're fit for purpose to meet the challenges that African nations face.
Well, I'm really glad to hear that, and please count on us if you need anything in that regard, and we look forward to working with you to make sure that Africans actually get a say in the decisions that are often being made about them. So thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. And now I recognize Representative Baird for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question focuses on the contributions for the international peacekeeping activities account. The U.S. government requested $1.31 billion for U.S. contributions to international peacekeeping throughout the sub-Saharan Africa. The request for these contributions to the failing UN missions in Central Africa and the Democratic Republic of Congo and Mali is $970 million. And by contrast, the coastal West African region receives only $100 million, and they spread that through the Global Fragility Act, and that's split between 5 countries. So my question, Assistant Secretary Fee, is: in today's resource-constrained environment, why does the department still view these contributions to UN peacekeeping operations in Africa as an effective use of resources that enhance U.S. national security?
Thank you very much, Congressman, for highlighting the challenges that these peacekeeping missions face. As I'm sure you know well, as a permanent member of the Security Council, dating to the founding of the Security Council, the United States pays an assessed contribution to support peacekeeping operations authorized by the Security Council. So that accounts for that funding request, and the peacekeeping efforts in Africa are among, if not the most challenging in the world, given the degraded security environments in which they operate and the challenges the troop contributing countries face in dealing with terrorist threats, such as in Mali, where they're dealing with threats from ISIS and from AQ. Also in the DRC, they're dealing with threats from armed militias as well as ISIS. And in CAR, there is the historic threat from insurgent groups there, and now the presence of the Wagner Group. In both CAR and in Mali, the Wagner Group has limited the operations of those peacekeeping missions, calling into question their utility. And I think it has led to the decision by the transitional government to ask for the mission to leave in Mali. So they're a bit of apples and oranges in terms of the funding, as again, assessed contributions rather than initiatives by Congress, such as through the GFA. Those are questions that we need to consider collectively about what's the best way to invest in Africa's security and development.
Thank you. And Assistant Administrator Mayangwa, the Global Facility and Fragility Act sets a decade-long time horizon on the address of political and social drivers of conflict, a laudable goal, but one insufficient to address the immediacy of the security threat posed by the JNIM and Islamic State, Greater Sahara. So how does the department balance resourcing the long-term goals of the GFA with the urgent need to improve security to the northern areas of the coastal West Africa?
Thank you so much for that question. I would start by pointing out that the GFA is part of a larger package of security support to the African continent that the United States provides. Part of it resides with the Department of Defense, and then there are programs by the Department of State as well as USAID. For USAID on the Global Fragility Act, as you know, the President approved those 10-year plans in March of this year, and we have started to implement in coastal West Africa, where we have 22 activities that are either being implemented or in the planning process. And we are focusing on the prevention side of it, which speaks to the larger security environment. So we have programs that are looking at border security, programs that provide for livelihoods, and so that we can build resilience in the communities that guards against potential recruitment by extremist forces. We are also looking at each country's context. And so the 10-year horizon actually gives us a certainty of being able to build on over the long term rather than the single-year funding. So we're really, really grateful for that, that it will continue to build on successes from this year going into the future to help minimize the vulnerabilities to violent extremism in the region and other sources of fragility.
Thank you. I now recognize Representative Cherflis McCormick for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Chairwoman. Late last year, as part of the U.S.-Africa Leadership Summit, President Biden issued an executive order directing the Secretary of State to establish the President's Advisory Council on African Diaspora Engagement in the United States. Assistant Secretary Fee, what is the status of establishing this council and choosing members?
We're so excited about this council. We're really thrilled to have the resources and talent of the American diaspora, the African diaspora in America to help us. Earlier this month, we sent forward to the Hill the regulatory framework that would guide the establishment of the council, and names have been selected through a conscientious and thorough process. They're being vetted right now, and our hope is that we can announce the names this month. Again, this is the 6-month anniversary of the summit, so we want to make sure that everyone sees what we're doing to act on the President's commitments.
And how do you envision the council changing the way the U.S. engages with the diaspora communities and related to U.S. policy?
I think the most important way it will change the way, what we do, it's not as if we've been disengaged with the diaspora communities, but it will formalize and make systematic our outreach, and we can then depend on leaders who've been tapped to support us to tap into their networks. So I think by elevating it to a presidential level, by tapping some of the greatest leaders in America, and by working with them formally, we'll be able to improve our engagement with them and their engagement with Africans.
Thank you so much for your testimony. Madam Chairwoman, I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize Representative Kim Lager-Dove for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to say, I know this was discussed, but Assistant Administrator, I think USAID is doing important work, and your work with PEPFAR has been transformational, and I certainly support a clean reauthorization. I also hope that we find ways to counter the recent policy in Uganda and work to make sure that it doesn't infect and affect the rest of the continent, because, you know, hate kills. Assistant Secretary, I would ask if you could find a way to maybe give this committee a briefing on the status of Ethiopia. I talked to some constituents last night, and there are some real concerns of a potential coup or deep unrest. And so hoping that, I just think that that country cannot afford that kind of instability. And lastly, I just want to say that I actually do believe that there's a strong correlation between the countries who were most brutal in their colonization and the perpetual instability of those respective countries. And I hope that we can find ways to lean on those European countries who are our allies to ask them to do better and to step up. So now my questions are, the Digital Transformation for Africa initiative, I believe, could be a game changer. And I would love to hear from both of you what metrics or goals are you using to both monitor its implementation and also to track its success?
She always makes me go first. We're so excited you've highlighted that. This has the potential to be impactful in a way that PEPFAR has been impactful. So we looked across the U.S. government to find all the different departments and agencies who in some way contributed to this effort. And we've identified $350 million in U.S. government funded programs and have tapped an additional $450 million in financing. So we're going to try and help expand digital access, digital literacy, and a good enabling environment. When the Vice President was in Zambia, building on work she's done in Latin America, she reached out to leaders in the private sector and asked them to match the U.S. government investment. So we need to turn those commitments into reality, but there's a lot of opportunity and interest there. We talked about the work we've been doing over the past few months to make real the commitments at the ALS. So we've set up a digital policy council within the government to sort of guide this investment and make sure we're taking advantage of these resources to really make a difference in this critical space. You had an opportunity to go to Abuja. I hope you can go to Lagos, where there's an incredible creative industry which is really engaged in the space. That's another area, for example, where the Diaspora Council can help us. So there's a lot of opportunities here. Everybody is focused on making good use of these resources to have the kind of impact that will make a difference in Africa. Dr.
Amen
Monday?
to the creative economy.
Yeah.
I have nothing more to add to that. I thought the Assistant Secretary covered that really well, except to say we are in lockstep with the Department of State in terms of the importance of the digital transformation in Africa to our future efforts across the development, security, and governance sectors.
So you have 1 extra minute of my time. So I would just like you to continue to talk about the vibrancy and the potential of the creative economy in Africa. You can talk about Lagos or you can go other places, but I think it's incredibly really important that we understand the power of this industry and how we can leverage it.
I would just say that one of the things I particularly enjoy in my job is visiting the continent with the young Africans and just seeing the creativity and the solutions and ideas that they are bringing to many of the challenges that their countries are facing in the security sector, in the health sector, in the education sector. And so creating an environment in which we can harness all of that really not just centers African agency, but also enables us to spend less on the humanitarian, the security issues over the long term. And so for me, finding ways of amplifying these creatives on the continent is absolutely critical to our success in terms of our U.S.-Africa engagement.
Thank you. And I want to thank both of you for your testimony and answering the questions from our members. So members, thank you so much for your engagement today. The members of the committee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we will ask you to respond to those in writing. And pursuant to committee rules, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, and extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length limitations. So without objection, the committee now stands adjourned.